It is His purpose to glorify Himself, but at the same time, it is His purpose to love His people, to demonstrate His mercy and His grace toward them. We're going to look at some passages today that are very, very important. We're going to start in the book of Psalms, chapter 44. Psalms 44, verse 26. Rise up, be our help, and redeem us for the sake of your loving kindness. Now, before we go to the commentary, I think there is something very important to say here. It's not a large verse. It's kind of tacked on to the end of a psalm that's not that well known. And yet we could plant ourselves here and stay here for days. And if we were keener in our insight and our heart was warmer, we could stay here an entire lifetime. We have to always be careful not to pass over a text. Or, having studied a text, take it and well, let me put it this way. Sometimes we look at a text, we study it, we think we know it, never to address it again. It's as though we've written a book on it and then we stick that book on a shelf and we never go back to it. You'll never exhaust a text. You will never become the expert of a text. And furthermore, it is not the goal ever that you master a text. It is the goal that the text master you. That's always the case. Well, let's read it again. Rise up, be our help, and redeem us for the sake of your loving kindness. I've written here, this petition serves an excellent reminder that God's salvation is not motivated by some virtue or intrinsic good in man, but by His unconditional and sovereign love. Now he says here, rise up and be our help and redeem us. Here the psalmist is calling upon the Lord to deliver His people after a devastating defeat by their enemies. The phrase rise up is an Hebrew idiom that often precedes a desperate appeal for help or deliverance. And the phrase redeem us is properly understood as such an appeal. Now, here they have suffered a terrible defeat. And as we know, their terrible defeat, their trials, their captivities were always caused by sin, by failure, by turning away from their God. It seems that at least some of the people in Israel had begun to realize, and most certainly the psalmist had, that if we are going to be saved, if we are going to be delivered, it will not be because of what we deserve. It will not be because of some virtue or merit on our part. And you say, of course, that's true. That's a great truth. They should have learned that quicker. Well, you should learn it quicker. When you look at your own life, if you are discerning, you will see that you trust in yourself a great deal more than you ought to. And though you wouldn't admit it, the way you live seems to indicate that God is going to bless you and help you and deliver you because of your own piety, because of something you have done or have not done. Or you'll see God use a man like a Dr. MacArthur or a Piper or a Spurgeon or an Edwards, and you think that it is because of their piety. You're wrong. It is by His grace. And a word that we do not often hear today, but I grow more and more to appreciate as I grow older, His pity. The pity He has toward us. The loving kindness that He has toward us. Now, don't make a mistake. I'm not saying that God uses rebellious, adulterous men in the ministry. But what I am saying is the most pious man you will ever meet has no reason whatsoever to boast before God. It is all a work of God's grace. all a work of God's grace. And it was not initiated by the piety he possesses. The piety he possesses, if he possesses any, has its foundation in grace. God's unmerited favor. Now, he gives a reason, a ground for God moving. He says, for the sake of your loving kindness. I've written, the ground of the psalmist's petition or appeal is not Israel's piety or merit, but the loving kindness or mercy of God. This is always the case. As you're growing in your Christian life, when you become a Christian, especially if it seems like God's hand's on you in an unusual way to preach or something, as you first become a Christian and begin to walk, you think so much has to do with you. So much has to do with you. That's one of the reasons why young men who start preaching early and going out on the streets begin to judge older men in the ministry as not being as pious as they ought to be, or certainly not as zealous as they ought to be. But these young men have a long way to go. A long way of humbling. A long way of God breaking them, so that in their life there will be a transference that in the end of their days they will bless. You see, when you start out, you think most of it depends upon you. What you do, what you become. But as you grow older, you see that everything depends upon His pity and loving kindness. The loving kindness and tender mercies He places upon a man. And there's also a transference not only of hope and confidence, but a transference of glory. You can no longer glory in self, but only in Him. Any achievement in your life, you know it comes from Him. Not just because you know Him, but after several years, you begin to know more about you. One thing for the young guys here who are going to preach, let me just say this. If you ever begin to believe the hype that people say about you, you're in trouble. You're in a great deal of trouble. But if you're a man who makes the night watch his friend, when there's no one else making noise, and you scan your life and compare it to the Word, you know that it's nothing but grace, and grace alone. Now, they are contented to ascribe their salvation to the unmerited goodness of God as the alone cause of it. Now, they are contented to ascribe their salvation to the goodness of God. They have learned, they have been trained that it is all of God, but they have become content in that. Now, we should never seek striving to be holy. We should never seek striving to be more and more like Christ, to have more virtue, to have more merit. But there's another sense, though, as we grow, we are going to be content in Him, and content in the fact that all our salvation springs forth from Him and from His mercy and His grace. And we begin to say with the psalmist, unto Thee be the glory. Only unto Thee. Not unto me. Unto Thee. And we're content with it. That's why the true believer that has grown something in maturity and been instructed will never have a problem with God doing everything for His own glory. He'll never have a problem with that. It's a reality in his life, but also, after the many years of failure, he sees that it's a necessity. If God does anything based upon what I deserve, there is no hope whatsoever.